Hey guys, tonight we begin with a slow little trip back to the year 1776. So dim the lights, maybe pull up a blanket and let your brain relax a bit. Because while most people hear the year 1776 and immediately picture powdered wigs, dramatically signing declarations, and patriotic music swelling in the background, the reality of everyday life was, well, a lot stranger, and often a little disturbing. Not in a loud, dramatic way. More in the quiet, slightly uncomfortable way that makes you pause and think, oh, people actually lived like that. And that's what we're going to explore tonight. Not the famous speeches, not the big political arguments, but the small daily routines of ordinary people living in early America. The way they woke up, what they ate, how they worked, and the tiny odd habits that filled their gaze. Because once you look closely, daily life in 1776 starts to feel like stepping into a world that is familiar and deeply weird at the same time. So let's begin with the morning, or rather, the extremely early morning. Because in 1776, the concept of sleeping until 8 or 9 in the morning would have sounded almost luxurious. Most people woke up with the sun, sometimes earlier. Farmers especially tended to rise somewhere around 4 or 5 in the morning, depending on the season. There were no alarm clocks, of course. Just roosters, light creeping through wooden shutters, and the quiet understanding that if you wanted food later, you probably needed to get moving now. Beds themselves were an experience. Mattresses were often stuffed with straw, corn husks, feathers, or whatever soft material a household could gather. Over time, these fillings would shift around into uncomfortable lumps. So every few weeks, someone in the house would open the mattress and fluff everything back into place. Otherwise, sleeping on it would start to feel like resting on a bag of crunchy leaves. And privacy, well, that was not really a common luxury. In many homes, several family members shared the same room, sometimes the same bed. This arrangement was considered perfectly normal. Travelers often slept beside complete strangers at inns, which might sound slightly horrifying today. But at the time, it was just practical. Beds were expensive, rooms were small, and people were generally too tired to worry about awkward sleeping arrangements. Once people finally dragged themselves out of bed, the next priority was fire. Keeping a household fire alive was one of the most important daily tasks. Fire meant warmth, cooking, and light. If the fire died overnight, someone would need to start the entire process again with flint and steel, which was slow, annoying, and not particularly fun before sunrise. So most families carefully preserved glowing embers overnight beneath ash. In the morning, they could gently coax those embers back into flame. A small act that probably saved countless early Americans from beginning the day with quiet frustration. Breakfast itself was usually simple, very simple. We're talking porridge, bread, maybe a little butter, and occasionally leftover meat if the household happened to have some. Coffee existed, though it wasn't yet the daily obsession it would later become. Tea was extremely popular, though politics had made it slightly controversial in certain circles after the famous tea protests a few years earlier. Still, people drank it, because honestly, when you're waking up at 5 in the morning in a chilly wooden house, a warm drink is hard to refuse. Political principles are important, but so is basic comfort. After breakfast, the real work began. And work in 1776 was constant. For farmers, the day involved fields, animals, tools, and long hours under the sun. Crops had to be planted, tended, harvested, and stored. Animals needed feeding and cleaning. Fences broke constantly and had to be repaired. And if something important broke, like a wagon wheel or a plow, you couldn't exactly order a replacement online and wait 2 days. Someone in the community had to physically build or repair it, usually a blacksmith, carpenter, or wheelwright, which meant waiting your turn, negotiating a price, and hoping the craftsman wasn't already buried under a pile of other repairs. Life in towns wasn't exactly relaxed either. Artisans worked extremely long hours. Tailors stitched clothes by hand. Bakers woke up long before sunrise to prepare bread. Printers spent entire days operating loud wooden presses that demanded strength and patience. And then there were apprentices, young teenagers who lived with a master craftsman to learn a trade. In theory, this was an educational opportunity. In practice, it also meant years of extremely hard work, strict discipline, and occasionally being shouted at for burning dinner or misplacing tools. Of course, daily life wasn't only work. There were small moments of social life woven through the routine. Neighbors visited each other frequently. Communities were tight, partly because they had to be. When winter arrived, cooperation was the difference between comfort and genuine hardship. Evenings were surprisingly lively in their own quiet way. After the day's work ended, families gathered around the fire. Someone might read aloud from a book or newspaper. Others mended clothes or prepared food for the next day. Candles provided dim light, but they were expensive enough that people used them carefully. You didn't leave candles burning casually in empty rooms. Every bit of wax mattered. Entertainment was simple but meaningful. Storytelling was common. Music, too. Someone might play a fiddle while others sang familiar songs. Sometimes neighbors gathered for small dances or community events. Nothing extravagant. Just people finding small bits of joy in a world that demanded a lot of effort to survive. Now let's gently glide into one of the slightly more disturbing details of daily life in 1776. Hygiene. Or rather, the version of hygiene that existed at the time. Bathing was not a daily habit for most people. In fact, it was often quite rare. Heating enough water for a full bath required serious effort. You needed to haul water, heat it over a fire, and pour it into a large tub. So bathing tended to happen occasionally rather than regularly. Instead, people focused on washing hands and faces more frequently. Full baths were more like an event. Toothbrushing existed, sort of. Some people cleaned their teeth with cloths, salt, or small sticks known as chew sticks. Toothpaste as we know, it did not exist yet, which means breath across the entire population was probably memorable. Clothing also followed its own strange rhythm. Washing clothes was extremely labor-intensive, so garments were worn repeatedly before cleaning. Linen undergarments helped absorb sweat and could be washed more easily than heavier outer clothes. And yes, lice were fairly common companions in daily life. Not exactly the charming detail you imagine in paintings of colonial elegance. Let's drift for a moment into food again, because the diet of 1776 Americans had its own quirks. Meals were seasonal, extremely seasonal. If certain foods were not available locally, you simply did without them until the next harvest. Preservation techniques were crucial. Meat was salted or smoked. Vegetables were pickled. Fruits were dried. Entire households spent weeks preparing food for winter. Sugar existed but was expensive. Desserts were therefore a treat rather than a daily habit, which probably explains why early American recipes often sound surprisingly heavy. When you finally had sugar, you used it generously. Now another slightly odd detail of the era involves medicine. Because medical knowledge in 1776 was evolving. Doctors existed, of course, but treatments sometimes relied on ideas that today sound a little questionable. Bloodletting was still widely practiced. The theory suggested that removing some blood could balance the body's internal systems. Leeches were occasionally involved. Yes, actual leeches. Herbal remedies were also common. Some worked surprisingly well. Others probably did very little beyond giving patients something hopeful to drink. But despite the odd treatments, communities often relied heavily on local knowledge. Midwives, herbalists, and experienced family members played major roles in everyday healthcare. And speaking of families, households in 1776 were often large. Children were expected to contribute to daily work from a fairly young age. Not in a cruel way necessarily, just as part of the family effort. Young boys might help in fields or workshops. Girls often assisted with cooking, sewing, and household management. Childhood included play, of course, but responsibility arrived early. Let's slowly drift now toward nighttime in 1776 America, because evenings ended much earlier than ours today. Without bright electric lighting, most activities naturally faded after sunset. People often went to bed not long after dark. But interestingly, sleep sometimes came in two segments. Historians have noted that many people practiced what's called segmented sleep. They would sleep for several hours, wake for a short quiet period around midnight, then return to sleep again until morning. During that quiet midnight hour, people might pray, read, or simply sit by the fading fire. A strangely peaceful rhythm when you think about it. And that gentle pattern brings us to the end of our first slow look at daily life in 1776. A world of early mornings, constant labor, simple food, and the occasional slightly alarming medical practice. But we're just getting started, because next, we'll wander deeper into colonial routines. From strange beauty standards to the surprisingly intense social rules that governed everyday behavior. So relax, take a breath, and let's continue drifting through the oddly fascinating world of 1776. And as the sun slowly rises again over our imaginary little colonial town, life in 1776 resumes its steady rhythm. Because if there was one thing early Americans truly understood, it was routine. Days followed familiar patterns. Work, meals, chores, sleep. Repeat the next day, and the day after that. Not necessarily exciting, but oddly comforting in its predictability. But beneath that calm surface, daily life was quietly full of strange social rules. Rules that people followed so naturally that they rarely questioned them. Rules about clothing, behavior, manners, and personal reputation. And if you happened to ignore those rules, well, your neighbors would definitely notice. Let's begin with clothing. Because clothing in 1776 was not just about staying warm or covering yourself. It was a very clear signal of social status. The moment someone stepped into a room, people could often tell a lot about them just by looking at their clothes. Wealthy individuals wore fabrics like silk, fine wool, or imported cotton. Their coats were carefully tailored, buttons were polished. Colors could be rich and decorative. Meanwhile, farmers and laborers typically wore sturdy homespun fabric. Rough wool, linen shirts, and practical leather shoes. Clothing was built to last rather than impress. And here's a slightly amusing detail. Clothes were extremely expensive compared to modern standards, so people owned far fewer garments. A single good coat might last many years. Repairs were constant. Patches were normal. No one threw away clothing just because it looked a little worn. Laundry itself was an event. A full day of boiling water, scrubbing fabric, and hanging heavy garments to dry. This often happened only once every few weeks. So if you ever wondered why colonial clothing and paintings look so clean and neat, well, those paintings were probably showing people on a very good day. Now let's float gently into something even more interesting. Personal appearance. Because colonial beauty standards had their own curious quirks. Pale skin was highly valued. Not because people disliked sunshine exactly, but because pale skin suggested that you didn't spend your entire day working outdoors in fields. In other words, it hinted at a slightly more comfortable life. Some wealthy women even used light powders or creams to maintain that pale appearance, which occasionally contained ingredients that, let's say, modern dermatologists might not recommend. Hair also carried meaning. Men often wore their hair longer than modern men typically do. And of course there were wigs. Large powdered wigs became fashionable among certain upper-class circles. Now, if you've ever looked at portraits from this period and wondered why everyone appears to be wearing a fluffy white cloud on their head, congratulations, that's the wig. Powdered wigs were considered elegant, refined, very sophisticated. They were also hot, expensive, and occasionally home to small insects if not properly maintained. which is a charming detail the portraits tend to leave out. Let's drift over now to social etiquette. Because politeness in 1776 was taken extremely seriously, good manners were a sign of moral character. People were expected to speak respectfully, avoid crude language, and behave with careful self-control in public. Young people were taught detailed rules of etiquette. How to greet elders, how to sit at the table, how to address strangers politely. Breaking these rules could damage your reputation surprisingly quickly. And reputation mattered a lot in small communities where everyone knew each other. If someone became known as lazy, dishonest, or rude, that reputation could follow them for years. Which brings us to another fascinating feature of colonial life: gossip. Yes, even in 1776, gossip was thriving. Without television, social media, or streaming services, people entertained themselves partly through conversation. And that conversation often included updates about neighbors, who was courting whom, who argued with their spouse, who borrowed tools and forgot to return them. Small details became community news. Of course, most gossip was harmless, but occasionally it could escalate into genuine social drama. Communities sometimes held public discussions about moral behavior. Church leaders, town officials, and respected elders might comment on someone's conduct if it became a public concern. Which leads us naturally into religion, because religion shaped daily life in powerful ways. Many early American communities organized their weekly routines around church attendance. Sunday services were long, often very long. 2 hours was normal, sometimes longer. People sat on hard wooden benches listening carefully to sermons that explored moral lessons, biblical interpretation, and proper behavior. Children were expected to sit quietly during these sermons, which probably felt like an eternity for anyone under the age of 10. Now let's gently transition into food culture again. Because food habits in 1776 had their own interesting rhythms. Dinner was usually the largest meal of the day. And unlike our modern evening dinner, it often happened earlier, sometimes around midday. This meal might include bread, vegetables, salted meat, stews, or pies. Everything depended on what was locally available. Colonial kitchens were busy places. Cooking involved open fires, iron pots, and heavy pans. Temperatures were difficult to control. Recipes required experience rather than exact measurements. If you were good at cooking in 1776, you were genuinely skilled. Now here's a small but fascinating detail. Water was not always the main drink at meals. In some places, people preferred small beer or cider. These beverages were mildly alcoholic, but safer to drink than untreated water in certain areas. Children sometimes drank diluted versions as well, which might sound surprising today, but it was simply part of daily life back then. Now let's wander outside for a moment and look at transportation. Travel in 1776 was slow. Very slow. Most people walked when possible. Horses were valuable but expensive to maintain. Wagons were useful but uncomfortable. Roads themselves were often rough dirt paths. After rain, they could become thick mud. A journey of 50 miles might take several days. So people tended to stay close to home communities unless travel was truly necessary. But when travelers did arrive in town, they brought news from distant places. News about politics, trade, and events happening across the colonies. And yes, 1776 was a year when political news was spreading quickly. Conversations about independence, taxes, and government were becoming more common. But interestingly, many ordinary people still focused far more on daily survival than on grand political debates. After all, when your primary concerns include growing food, repairing tools, and preparing for winter, international politics can feel slightly distant. Now let's drift toward another odd detail of colonial daily life: lighting. Once the sun disappeared, darkness arrived quickly. Candles and oil lamps provided some light, but they were limited. So evenings naturally slowed down. People finished essential tasks, talked quietly by the fire, and gradually prepared for sleep. And during winter, Nights were very long indeed, which meant families spent many hours indoors together, sewing, carving tools, repairing clothing, reading scripture, or simply talking about the day. It wasn't glamorous, but it was deeply human, and strangely calming when you imagine it. So as the quiet colonial evening settles in again, our little town grows peaceful. Fires glow softly inside wooden homes. Candles flicker beside simple tables. And outside, the dark countryside stretches quietly beneath the stars. But don't get too comfortable just yet, because next, we'll explore some of the more unusual aspects of colonial life. From bizarre medical habits, to the strange and sometimes hilarious rules about courtship and marriage in 1776. And trust me, some of those rules were surprisingly creative. So take a breath, relax a little deeper, and we'll continue our slow walk through the oddly fascinating world of early America. And as another quiet colonial morning slowly arrives, the town begins waking up again. Doors creak open. Chickens wander across dusty yards. Someone is already chopping wood before sunrise, because of course they are. And somewhere nearby, a young man is nervously rehearsing a conversation in his head, because today, he might try to visit someone he's been thinking about for weeks. Romance in 1776 was not exactly spontaneous. It wasn't the kind of casual dating culture we know today. Instead, courtship followed a careful dance of rules, expectations, and watchful neighbors who noticed everything. If a young man wanted to show interest in a woman, he didn't just send a message or casually ask her to meet for coffee. He usually began by visiting her family home. Yes, the family home, where her parents were present, often sitting right there in the same room. Nothing like a quiet audience to make romance slightly more awkward. These visits were called calling. A young man might arrive in the evening, politely greet the family, and sit down to talk. Conversation remained respectful, sometimes painfully respectful. Small talk about weather, work, and community news was common. Compliments were subtle. No dramatic declarations of love. Just careful politeness slowly building over time. Parents paid very close attention to these interactions. After all, marriage in 1776 was not only about romance. It was also about stability, reputation, and practical partnership. Families often wanted to know whether a potential suitor was hardworking, reliable, and capable of supporting a household. In other words, could this person handle the endless responsibilities of colonial life? Because marriage in early America came with a long list of practical duties. Running a household required constant effort. Cooking, cleaning, sewing, food preservation, childcare, and managing resources. And yes, large families were extremely common. Children were both a joy and a necessity in a farming society where extra hands meant extra help. Now here's one of the slightly strange traditions connected to courtship in certain regions of colonial America. Something known as bundling. Bundling was a supervised method that allowed couples to spend time together while still maintaining social rules about modesty. In some communities, a courting couple might sit or lie together on a bed while fully clothed. Sometimes a wooden board called a bundling board was placed between them. Yes, a literal board. The idea was that couples could talk privately, perhaps hold hands, and get to know each other. While the board prevented things from becoming too enthusiastic. Was this system perfect? Probably not. But it reflects how communities tried to balance human curiosity with strict social expectations. Of course, not every region practiced bundling. But the very existence of the idea gives us a small glimpse into the creative ways people managed courtship. Now let's talk about weddings themselves. Colonial weddings were generally simple events compared to the extravagant celebrations we sometimes see today. A ceremony often took place at home or in a local church. A minister would perform the service. Friends and family gathered close by. Afterward, there might be a modest feast. Bread, meat, pies, maybe cider. Music if someone brought a fiddle. The entire community often participated in celebrating the new couple. Because in a small town, a marriage was not just a personal event. It strengthened social connections across families. Once married, couples quickly settled into the routine of daily life. And that routine was busy, very busy. The husband typically focused on farming, trade, or a craft profession. Long hours outdoors were common. Meanwhile, the wife managed household operations, which included cooking multiple meals a day, caring for children, maintaining clothing, and organizing food storage for winter. And remember, all of this happened without modern appliances. No electric stoves, no refrigerators, no washing machines, just hard work, skill, and patience. Despite the workload, families still found time for small moments of connection. Evenings around the fire were important. Conversations, shared meals, and storytelling created a sense of comfort at the end of long days. Children often listened carefully to stories about family history or moral lessons. Which brings us to childhood itself. In 1776, children were expected to grow up quickly compared to modern standards. By the age of 7 or 8, many children were already helping with meaningful tasks. Feeding animals, carrying water, gathering firewood, or assisting in workshops. Education varied widely. Some children attended small local schools where they learned reading, writing, and arithmetic. Others were taught at home by parents or older relatives. Books were valuable possessions, so reading aloud was a common learning method. And when children weren't working or studying, they did manage to play. Games often involved simple toys made from wood or cloth. Balls, spinning tops, dolls, and handmade puzzles. Outdoor play was especially common. Running, climbing, exploring nearby woods. In many ways, childhood still carried joy, even in a world with heavy responsibilities. Now let's drift slowly into another curious part of colonial social life: community gatherings. Because despite the constant work, people truly valued opportunities to come together. Barn raisings were famous examples. When a family needed a new barn, neighbors gathered to help construct it quickly. Dozens of people working together could raise the structure in a single day. These events combined labor with celebration. Food was shared, stories were exchanged. Music sometimes followed. It was a practical system built on cooperation. And it helped communities survive the challenges of rural life. Religious gatherings also played a huge role in social interaction. Church meetings, seasonal festivals, and community days created regular opportunities for people to connect. Sometimes traveling preachers arrived with energetic sermons that attracted large crowds, which occasionally turned quiet towns into surprisingly lively places for a day or two. But eventually the excitement faded and daily routines returned. Fields still needed tending. Tools still needed repair. Children still needed guidance. And life continued its steady rhythm. As night falls again over our peaceful little colonial settlement, candles flicker behind wooden windows. Some families finish late chores before heading to bed. Others sit quietly around the fire, enjoying a moment of rest. Somewhere in town, a young couple might still be sitting awkwardly on opposite sides of a bundling board, discussing the weather in extremely polite tones. Romance in 1776 was certainly patient, and with that calm image in mind, we'll gently continue our journey next time, because there are still many strange and fascinating details waiting ahead. From unusual health remedies, to the peculiar ways early Americans dealt with sickness, danger, and the everyday uncertainties of life. So relax a little deeper, and we'll keep drifting through the quietly bizarre world of 1776. And as our quiet colonial town stretches into another slow morning, we arrive at one of the more curious aspects of daily life in 1776, health, or more specifically, the fascinating collection of ideas people used to stay healthy in a world where modern medicine did not yet exist. Now, to be fair, early American doctors were not foolish. Many were educated, thoughtful people doing their best with the knowledge available at the time. But that knowledge was still heavily influenced by medical traditions that dated back hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. and some of those traditions were a little unusual. Let's begin with the basic idea that guided much of medical thinking in the 18th century: the theory of bodily balance. Many doctors believed the human body contained several internal fluids, sometimes called humors. Health depended on keeping these humors in balance. If something went wrong, the body might become too hot, too cold, too wet, or too dry. And when that happened, treatment aimed to restore balance. This is where one of the most famous colonial medical practices appears: bloodletting. Yes, the quiet and slightly unsettling idea that removing a portion of a person's blood might help them recover from illness. Doctors sometimes used small blades or lancets to open a vein. Other times they relied on leeches, small creatures that happily attached themselves to skin and did the job naturally. From our modern perspective, this sounds questionable. But at the time, it was considered a perfectly reasonable treatment for fevers, headaches, infections, and various mysterious ailments that doctors were trying to understand. And surprisingly, some patients did recover afterward. Though whether that was due to the treatment itself or simply the body healing naturally is a topic historians still debate. Another common medical tool of the era was the purge. If a doctor believed illness came from something harmful inside the body, they might prescribe medicines designed to empty the stomach or intestines. These remedies were not exactly pleasant. They were often strong herbal mixtures that encouraged the body to, well, remove whatever it could as quickly as possible. Colonial pharmacies were filled with jars of powdered plants, dried roots, and mysterious tinctures. Some were genuinely helpful. Others probably tasted terrible and did very little. Now here's something interesting. In many communities, doctors were not the only medical authorities. Midwives played an incredibly important role, especially in childbirth. These women often had decades of practical experience assisting mothers through pregnancy and delivery. Their knowledge was passed down through generations. For many families, the midwife was the most trusted healthcare provider in town. Herbal medicine was also extremely common. Plants like chamomile, mint, willow bark, and sage were used to treat various conditions. Willow bark, for example, contains natural compounds related to modern aspirin. So occasionally, colonial remedies worked surprisingly well. Of course, diagnosing illness in 1776 could be difficult. Without microscopes or advanced testing, doctors relied heavily on observation. They looked at symptoms, listened to patients describe how they felt, and tried to match those signs with known patterns of illness. Sometimes they guessed correctly, other times the diagnosis remained a mystery. Now let's gently shift our attention to another everyday health concern in colonial life: injuries. Because in a world full of manual labor, injuries were extremely common. Farmers used sharp tools. Blacksmiths handled hot metal. Carpenters worked with heavy timber. Cuts, burns, and broken bones were part of daily life. Treatment often involved simple bandages, herbal salves, and a lot of patience while the body healed. Fortunately, the human body is remarkably resilient. But recovery could take time, especially without modern pain relief. Speaking of pain relief, alcohol played an interesting role in early medicine. Small amounts of rum, brandy, or whiskey were sometimes used to dull pain during certain procedures. Not exactly anesthesia as we know it today, but it was something. Now let's talk about another challenge people faced in 1776. Disease. Illnesses like smallpox, influenza, and various fevers moved through communities from time to time. Smallpox in particular was feared across the colonies. The disease could spread quickly and had serious consequences. But here's a fascinating development. By the late 18th century, a method called inoculation was beginning to appear in some areas. Inoculation involved deliberately exposing a person to a small amount of smallpox material in hopes of producing a milder infection that would later provide immunity. This idea was controversial. Some people believed it was dangerous. Others believed it was life-saving. Debates about the practice could become quite heated. But gradually, more communities began experimenting with it as a protective measure, which shows something interesting about colonial society. Even in a time of limited knowledge, people were constantly searching for better solutions. Now let's move gently into another aspect of daily health: diet and nutrition. As we mentioned earlier, food in 1776 depended heavily on local crops and seasonal availability. This meant that diets sometimes lacked certain nutrients during parts of the year. Fresh fruits and vegetables were plentiful during harvest seasons, but winter diets often relied on preserved foods. Salted meat, dried grains, pickled vegetables. These foods kept people alive through harsh winters, but they didn't always provide perfect nutrition. Still, people adapted remarkably well. Strong physical labor combined with simple diets created a population that was often physically tough, even if medical care remained basic. Now let's pause for a small detail that historians find fascinating: sleep habits. As we briefly mentioned earlier, many people in the 18th century followed a pattern called segmented sleep. They went to bed soon after darkness, slept for several hours, woke for a short period around midnight, then returned to sleep again. During that quiet waking period, people might pray, read, check the fire, or simply sit quietly. This pattern seemed completely natural to them. Only later, with artificial lighting and modern schedules, did continuous 8-hour sleep become more common. Which makes you wonder whether our ancestors might have understood something about rest that modern society occasionally forgets. Now as our slow evening settles again over the colonial town, the firelight flickers softly inside wooden homes. Someone stirs a pot of herbal tea. A tired farmer stretches after a long day in the fields. Children slowly drift toward sleep beneath heavy wool blankets. Life in 1776 was demanding, but it also carried a certain steady rhythm. Work, rest, community, and survival all woven together into a pattern that repeated day after day. And while the medical practices of the time might make modern readers raise an eyebrow or two, they were simply part of a world still learning how the human body worked. Next, we'll continue exploring that world, because daily life in 1776 also included unusual punishments, strange legal customs, and the sometimes awkward ways communities tried to maintain order. And trust me, some of those methods were surprisingly creative, so settle in a little deeper, and we'll continue our quiet journey through the satisfyingly strange routines of early America. And as our calm little colonial town wakes up yet again, we drift into another part of daily life that people in 1776 took very seriously: law and order. Because while early American communities often looked peaceful on the surface, maintaining that peace required a system of rules, expectations, and occasionally, some very public reminders of what happened when those rules were ignored. Now, unlike modern cities with large police departments and complicated legal systems, colonial towns usually relied on a handful of local officials to keep things running smoothly. There might be a town constable, a few magistrates, and perhaps some respected elders who helped resolve disputes. Most communities were small enough that people already knew each other quite well, which meant that when someone caused trouble, the entire town usually heard about it fairly quickly. And that leads us to one of the most fascinating aspects of colonial justice: public punishment. In 1776, punishment was often designed not just to correct behavior, but to make sure everyone else noticed what had happened. It was part justice, part public lesson, and occasionally a little humiliating. One of the most famous examples was the stocks. You may have seen pictures of these before. A wooden frame placed in a public square with holes for a person's wrists and sometimes their ankles. The unfortunate individual would stand there, locked into place, while the rest of the community walked past. Sometimes people simply stared. Other times they offered commentary, and occasionally, someone might toss a vegetable or two. It was not exactly comfortable, but it was considered an effective way to discourage certain behaviors. Another device was the pillory, which worked in a similar way but held a person upright with their head and hands secured. Crimes that might lead to these punishments included petty theft, drunken behavior, or causing disturbances in town. The goal was not necessarily long-term imprisonment. Instead, it was quick correction followed by public embarrassment. And surprisingly, this system often worked. In small communities where reputation mattered deeply, a single afternoon in the stocks could leave a lasting impression. Now let's drift gently into another curious tradition: public apologies. If someone had behaved poorly or spread harmful gossip, they might be required to stand in church and publicly admit their mistake. Yes, right there in front of the entire congregation. You can imagine how awkward that must have felt. But again, the goal was restoring harmony within the community. Once someone apologized and acknowledged their error, people were often willing to move on. Colonial society valued social balance. Conflict was uncomfortable for everyone involved. Of course, not all legal matters were quite so mild. Property disputes sometimes became serious arguments. Land ownership was extremely important, especially in farming regions where every acre mattered. Neighbors might argue over fences, boundaries, or wandering livestock. These disagreements were usually settled by local courts or mediators. And interestingly, many cases relied heavily on testimony from neighbors who had witnessed the situation, which meant that being known as honest and reliable could significantly influence the outcome of a dispute. So once again, reputation played a powerful role in everyday life. Now let's shift our attention to another everyday rule that shaped colonial behavior: alcohol consumption. Yes, people in 1776 definitely enjoyed their cider, beer, and occasional stronger drinks. Taverns were common gathering places where travelers exchanged news and locals relaxed after long days of work. But excessive drinking was frowned upon. Public drunkenness could land someone in the stocks or facing a stern lecture from local officials. Moderation was considered a sign of good character. And speaking of taverns, they were more than just places to drink. They were social centers. Travelers stopped there for food and lodging. Merchants discussed business. Farmers exchanged news about crops and weather. In a world without instant communication, taverns acted almost like early information hubs. If something important had happened in a nearby town, chances were someone would mention it over a mug of cider. Now let's slowly wander into the world of colonial travel again, because visitors occasionally brought something more exciting than news. They brought entertainment. Traveling performers sometimes passed through towns offering music, storytelling, or small theatrical shows. These performances were simple compared to modern entertainment, but they could draw enthusiastic crowds. After weeks or months of routine work, a little music and laughter felt refreshing. Another source of entertainment came from fairs and seasonal gatherings. Harvest festivals were especially important. After months of hard labor, communities celebrated successful harvests with food, music, and games. Children ran through fields while adults shared meals and stories. For a brief moment, life felt lighter. Then winter arrived. And winter in 1776 was no small matter. Cold weather transformed daily routines dramatically. Fields became quiet under frost. Outdoor work slowed. Families spent more time indoors around fireplaces. Firewood became precious. Entire days might be spent chopping logs, stacking them carefully, and making sure the household fire never went out. Without steady heat, survival could become difficult very quickly. Food stores were also carefully monitored. Salted meat, preserved vegetables, and stored grains needed to last until spring. Every jar, every sack, every smoked cut of meat represented hours of preparation during warmer months. Colonial households learned to plan carefully. And during those long winter evenings, families often turned again to quiet activities: sewing, tool repair, reading, and storytelling. Stories were an essential part of social life. Tales about ancestors, strange events, or distant places filled many evenings with quiet fascination. Children listened closely, absorbing lessons hidden within the stories. Because in a world without endless digital distractions, imagination played a much larger role in entertainment. Now, as another peaceful night settles over our imaginary colonial town, we see once again how life in 1776 moved through a steady cycle. Work, community, discipline, and rest. Occasional embarrassment in the stocks, but also moments of laughter, cooperation, and shared survival. It was a world that demanded resilience, yet also offered a strong sense of belonging within small communities. And as we continue our slow journey through this oddly satisfying past, we'll soon explore something equally fascinating: the surprising jobs people held in colonial America, including some occupations that sound perfectly normal today, and others that feel strangely unfamiliar. So relax again, settle a little deeper into your blanket, and we'll continue wandering through the quietly peculiar routines of 1776. And as the soft glow of morning light slowly spreads across our quiet colonial town once again, people begin stepping out of their homes to start another ordinary day in 1776, which, as it turns out, was rarely a lazy day. Because if there is one thing historians consistently notice about life in early America, it is how constantly busy everyone seemed to be. Work was not simply a part of life. Work was life. Most families lived on farms, which meant that the rhythm of each day followed the needs of crops, animals, weather, and the changing seasons. A farmer in 1776 did not specialize in one narrow task. Instead, he was part gardener, part carpenter, part mechanic, and occasionally part veterinarian. If a fence broke, he fixed it. If a plow snapped, he repaired it. If a cow wandered too far into the woods, he went looking for it. And if a sudden storm threatened the crops, the entire household rushed outside to protect what they could. It was a constant cycle of observation and reaction. And farming itself required remarkable patience. Seeds were planted carefully in the spring, nurtured through summer heat, and finally harvested when autumn arrived. A single mistake in timing could ruin months of work. But farmers were not the only people keeping colonial towns alive. Artisans filled the small streets with the steady sounds of craft and industry. The blacksmith, for example, was one of the most essential workers in any community. His forge glowed with heat as he shaped iron into horseshoes, tools, hinges, nails, and countless other objects people needed every day. Without the blacksmith, farming tools broke and wagons stopped moving, so naturally, everyone knew where his shop was. Nearby, the carpenter worked with timber from surrounding forests, transforming rough logs into beams, furniture, barrels, and sometimes entire buildings. Colonial houses did not arrive neatly assembled from factories. They were built piece by local craftsmen who understood the quirks of wood, weather, and structure. And when those houses needed windows, people visited the glazier. Glassmaking was delicate work in the 18th century. Window panes were smaller than modern ones, often slightly uneven, and occasionally full of tiny bubbles from the manufacturing process. But they allowed light into homes, which was a luxury many earlier generations had lacked. Another important figure was the cooper. Now the cooper might not sound glamorous, but his work was everywhere. He made barrels. And barrels in 1776 were essential. Food was stored in them. Liquids were transported in them. Salted fish, flour, apples, cider, nails, and even gunpowder traveled inside wooden barrels built carefully by skilled coopers. A well-made barrel could survive years of heavy use, which meant a talented cooper rarely ran out of customers. Then there were the weavers and tailors. Clothing did not appear magically in stores. Every shirt, coat, dress, and pair of stockings required careful work with spinning wheels, looms, needles, and thread. Women in many households spent hours spinning wool or flax into yarn. That yarn was then woven into fabric. And once fabric existed, tailors stepped in to shape it into wearable clothing. The result was garments that were often simple but sturdy. Fashion in 1776 moved slowly compared to modern trends. People valued durability more than novelty. If a coat lasted 10 years, that was considered excellent craftsmanship. Now let's quietly step into another fascinating occupation, the printer. In towns large enough to support one, the printing shop was a center of communication. Newspapers, pamphlets, announcements, and small books were produced on hand-operated presses. The work required careful arrangement of individual metal letters, placed one by one into frames before ink was applied and paper pressed down firmly. It was slow work, but it spread ideas. And in the 1770s, ideas were spreading rapidly throughout the American colonies. Conversations about independence, rights, and political change were circulating through printed words that passed from hand to hand. Even in quiet towns, people occasionally gathered to read new pamphlets aloud and discuss what they meant. Now let's wander toward the waterfront for a moment. In coastal towns, fishing and shipping created entire industries of work. Sailors repaired nets, maintained boats, and loaded cargo onto ships that traveled along the Atlantic coast. Merchants traded goods between colonies and distant countries. Sugar from the Caribbean, tea from Asia, manufactured goods from Europe, and raw materials from America all moved through busy ports. It was a complex web of trade that connected even small communities to the wider world. But daily life for most people remained very local. Neighbors depended on one another constantly. If a barn collapsed during a storm, nearby farmers might gather to help rebuild it. These events were called barn raisings, and they were equal parts hard labor and social gathering. Food appeared, tools were shared, and by sunset, a new structure might stand where empty ground had existed that morning. Moments like that reveal something important about colonial life. Individual effort mattered, but community cooperation mattered just as much. No family truly survived alone. Now let's turn briefly to another group whose work filled many quiet corners of colonial towns. Children. Yes, childhood in 1776 looked very different from childhood today. Young boys and girls often began helping with household tasks at an early age. They collected firewood, carried water, fed animals, and assisted with farming chores. Older children might learn trades by becoming apprentices. An apprentice lived with a craftsman and slowly learned the skills of the profession over several years. It was a demanding system, but it also offered young people a path toward independence and expertise. And eventually, some apprentices became masters of their craft. Which brings us back to the steady rhythm that shaped everyday life. Morning work, midday meals, evening chores, and finally, the quiet comfort of rest when darkness returned. As our imaginary town slowly settles into another peaceful night, lanterns flicker in windows while families gather near warm hearths. Tools are set aside for tomorrow. Animals rest in their barns. And somewhere, a tired farmer stretches his arms after another long day of labor. Life in 1776 could be exhausting, but it also carried a certain simple clarity. Work had purpose, communities had structure, and the routines of each day created a rhythm that felt strangely steady, even in a world that was slowly moving toward enormous historical change. And as we continue drifting through this calm historical landscape, there is still one more fascinating piece of everyday life to explore. Because even in this quiet, hard-working society, people still found ways to relax, celebrate, and occasionally enjoy themselves in ways that might surprise us today. So settle in once more, and we'll wander into the lighter side of life in 1776 America. And as the slow rhythm of colonial life continues, we arrive at a question that quietly sits in the background of all this work and responsibility. When people in 1776 finally finished their chores, their farming, their crafting, and their endless small repairs, what exactly did they do to relax? The answer, interestingly enough, is not very loud or dramatic. Entertainment in colonial America was simple, slow, and often shared with neighbors. There were no glowing screens, no endless music playlists, and certainly no late-night streaming marathons. Instead, relaxation usually came in the form of small gatherings, gentle hobbies, and community traditions that filled the quieter hours of the day. Let's start with one of the most common forms of colonial entertainment: conversation. Yes, simply talking. In a world where news traveled slowly and written material was limited, people spent long evenings exchanging stories and discussing events. Families gathered around fireplaces after dinner, while neighbors sometimes stopped by for visits. A single conversation could wander through many topics: weather, crops, local gossip, strange travelers passing through town, or rumors about events happening far away in larger cities. These conversations were not rushed. They unfolded slowly, sometimes lasting for hours while candles burned lower and the fire crackled quietly in the hearth. Another peaceful pastime was reading. Books in 1776 were not as common as they are today, but they were highly valued. A household might own a few carefully preserved volumes. Religious texts were very common, but there were also collections of poetry, history, and practical guides about farming or craftsmanship. When someone in the family could read aloud, it often became an evening activity. One person would sit near the fire and slowly read passages while others listened. It was calm, steady, and oddly comforting. Now let's drift into another relaxing activity that appeared in many homes: music. Colonial music was usually played on simple instruments like fiddles, flutes, or small stringed instruments. Someone in the family might know a handful of songs that had been passed down through generations. These songs were often performed during gatherings, celebrations, or quiet evenings when people felt like lifting their spirits. No grand concerts. No enormous orchestras. Just a few voices, a simple melody, and the soft rhythm of a wooden floor beneath tired feet. Dancing also appeared from time to time, especially during community celebrations. Harvest festivals, weddings, and seasonal gatherings sometimes included organized dances where couples moved carefully through traditional steps. The music was lively, but the atmosphere remained friendly and relaxed. And after long months of hard work, these events gave people a chance to laugh, talk, and reconnect with neighbors. Now here is something that might surprise modern listeners. Outdoor games were quite popular. Simple competitions like running, wrestling, or tossing objects for distance were common forms of recreation. Children invented endless variations of tag, hide and seek, and other energetic games that required little more than imagination and open space. Adults occasionally joined as well, especially during community fairs. Speaking of fairs, these gatherings were some of the most anticipated events of the year. Farmers displayed crops. Craftsmen showed off their work. Food stalls offered pies, roasted meats, and warm cider. Traveling performers sometimes arrived with juggling acts, puppet shows, or storytelling performances that entertained crowds. For a small town, a fair could feel like a major event. It brought together people who might not have seen each other for months. News spread quickly, friendships were renewed. And for a short time, the routine pace of daily life became slightly more festive. Now let's gently move toward another quieter hobby that many colonists enjoyed: writing. Letters were an important way to stay connected with distant relatives and friends. Writing a letter was not something rushed between errands. It was a thoughtful process that required careful wording and neat handwriting. A single letter might travel for weeks before reaching its destination. But when it finally arrived, it carried news, emotions, and connections that helped people feel less isolated in a vast and expanding land. Some individuals also kept journals or diaries, recording small observations about weather, crops, and daily experiences. These quiet records have become incredibly valuable to historians today. They reveal the thoughts and routines of ordinary people living ordinary lives centuries ago. Now, as evening slowly settles over our imaginary colonial town once again, the pace of life begins to soften. Lanterns glow gently inside homes. Families gather for one final meal of the day. Outside, the sounds of animals settling into barns blend with the distant creak of wagon wheels returning home. Perhaps someone begins playing a fiddle. A child laughs softly somewhere in the darkness, and the entire town gradually drifts toward rest. Life in 1776 was not easy. It demanded strength, patience, and constant effort. But within that demanding world, people still carved out small pockets of calm and enjoyment. Simple music, warm fires, shared stories, and the quiet satisfaction of another day completed. So as our journey through this strangely satisfying slice of history comes to a close, we can see that daily life in 1776 America was full of contrasts. Hard work mixed with simple pleasures, strict rules balanced by community support, and routines that might seem unusual to us today, yet somehow feel comforting in their steady rhythm. A world slower than ours, rougher than ours, but in its own quiet way, strangely peaceful. And if you listen closely, you could almost hear the faint creak of wooden floors, the soft rustle of wind through colonial fields, and the gentle murmur of voices fading into another calm American night in the year 1776.